Hello and welcome to the Being and Becoming podcast. Together we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. I'm joined today by my two regular co-hosts, Austin Sohn and Patrick Dyer. Tell everyone how you're doing, guys.
We doing well.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon.
Today we'll be discussing Chapter 10, Be Precise in Your Speech from 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos by Jordan Peterson. In this chapter, some of the notes that I made for just to discuss up top are shorter than most sections because he talks about things, which entails the complexity of the world, objects, and perception. He then goes on to talk about dragons, sins of omission, marriage, and how important our speech is, and being precise with our speech. So I'll turn it over to you guys to get any initial thoughts that you had on this chapter.
I think the first topic that comes up is perception. Perception opens up a can of worms when it comes to philosophy, because I think a common problem that philosophers, when I say philosophers, usually it would be Western European, 17th century, 18th century philosophers trying to figure out the veil of perception is what they called it. So I'll start with that, but were there thoughts on what was said in the chapter about how we perceive things and how when things go wrong, that's when we notice them and that's when we start to perceive them?
I thought the complexity of the world description that he gave was fascinating because we only really focus on very fine-tune specific things, but then everything outside of that is a mystery to us. The car, I thought, was a very helpful example, and for the listener to give a little background and clarity to this, he talks about the use of a car. We don't think of all of the little individual things that are happening with the car. We just think of the car as a thing that gets us from one place to another. And I thought that was a very helpful example to maybe apply that to how we view the world as well. We're not viewing the things in the world as things. We're viewing them as their utility. He also gives an example of the screwdriver, how when you pick up a tool, it becomes essentially an extension of you. So when you're screwing a nail into the wall, you can feel the screwdriver, you can feel the pressure and the weight of the screw going in and the resistance or whatever. I thought that was fascinating because it's not just a tool, it essentially becomes an extension of you, or the car becomes an extension of you as well, in that it facilitates you moving from point A to point B. This perception goes awry when things go wrong, as you're alluding to, Austin. For example, the car that I was just talking about, say that there's an issue with the car, like if your brakes go out, then all of a sudden you're concerned with the mechanics of how the car works. Whereas before you weren't really concerned about that. You just knew that was the thing that got you from point A to point B. But when it stops working, all of a sudden you need to become fascinated with, how does the brake pad work? I don't know that much about brakes. So like whatever the issue is, how does that thing work? So then I can fix it and just go back to my narrow perception of getting from point A to point B and not be concerned with the car itself, the mechanics.
The world is complex, and we can drown in that complexity. And something he encourages people to do is, because the world is so complex and our perception's only so limited, we have to be precise in our speech and we have to be precise in our aim. So what are your thoughts on the danger of not having an aim or not having a purpose as we live in this complex world? If you don't have a purpose or an aim, I think you don't have enough. If we're still talking about this order and chaos, the line between order and chaos. So if you're not having an aim, I feel like the chaos will rush in. If you don't have a purpose, the chaos will rush in, especially just with the society that we live in. We've talked about nihilism before. We've talked about maybe existentialism before too. Like, if you don't really have a purpose, I think the complexity of the world and the possible suffering in it can just kind of take you over. And yeah.
And another thing to add is it's not that having a good definition on things or being able to define things or aim things well doesn't mean that chaos will be prevented, but it means you will be better able to counteract or combat or fight it when it does occur, which will lead to less stress over time, less chaos over time, and you'll stay on the intended path.
Yes.
Well, I think that was a great point, Pat, because he talks so much about speech in this chapter and how important speech is. And part of defining your aim, and to last chapter, I think just being able to speak helps you clear your thoughts, or to better articulate what you think. I think being precise in our aim requires us to be precise in our speech. And being precise in our speech, I think, could lead, or maybe you could argue should lead to conflict.
Ooh, yeah.
Conflict maybe within yourself, but then also externally, maybe with some of your other relationships in your life. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I agree. I like that a lot, actually. That sparked some thoughts.
Well, it's purposed. So, right, if you have an aim, we've talked about this idea before, when you voluntarily take on a task, you're kind of accepting the suffering that's going to come your way, and you're accepting it as kind of a sacrifice for a better outcome. I think the best example I have off the top of my head is working out, right? There's quite a bit of difficulty and pain involved, and maybe even suffering you can describe if you're working out really hard, but you're focused and you're willing to take that on, and it's, in a control. It's not really happening to you. It's something that you're voluntarily taking on, and that suffering is able to be turned into something that you want. So that's how kind of the chaos of the pain can be turned into something, as long as you're being smart with your path of working out, right? Because if you're not working out smartly, you could get hurt, and then that pain would take over. Does that give a good example?
Yeah, I think it does. Definitely does.
I was thinking more important decisions, like life decisions. So, say job, family, religious affiliation, things like that. That's more or less what I was
There's this
about.
biblical idea that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot that he really likes, separating the wheat from the chaff. And this is one of the ways in which you do it. You just set your aim, you define it, you be precise in it. And as you are pursuing the aim with the precision, that is in a way separating the wheat from the chaff and cleaning the things that shouldn't be there out, whether that be relationships or personal habits or sins of omission,
Yeah.
anything like that.
So I did notice he talked about the wheat and the chaff at the end of the chapter, and I think that's where being precise in your speech kind of maybe was introduced in this chapter. Although I think he's touched on it in other places, to be fair. But I think, Austin, based on what Pat was just saying, I think you did give a great example then of working out could be that aim that you have in your life, and you want to be precise about it, so you don't want to overexert yourself or take on too much weight, because then you can strain yourself, hurt yourself, and prevent you from doing the thing that you've set out to do. But then you can also be specific in what areas do you want to work out. Instead of being general, maybe get more specific, and then that can help you achieve or form a goal, which then you can set out to achieve. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me now. Yep.
Will you humor me if I could take us down a quick tangent as it relates to philosophy?
Sure.
Because I've been kind of studying this figure during the Enlightenment in philosophy. So, Enlightenment, within the history of philosophy, the Enlightenment happened maybe 1400s, 1500s to like 1800s. And it was just this shift from seeing the world as divinely created, and like almost every people group having some sort of religious ideas, to this idea that reason in our perception of the world is more important than anything outside of that. So it's kind of depending on our own perception. And then that became more and more important to people, to the point where the idea of not having a God existing became possible. And this has to do with perception, because people in the Enlightenment started trusting their own perception more than the creation that testified to a divine reality. But there's a problem when that happens, because we're pretty finite and our perceptions are finite. But the Enlightenment is like, our reason is so important, we can do so many things. And then like the Industrial Revolution kind of comes out of that. So there's a lot that happens from the Enlightenment. But then that kind of leads to what we've talked about a lot in this podcast, which is nihilism. Because when the world is just all about our own fallen perceptions, we can kind of start to feel like there might be nothingness. But then we can forget about the fact that we're created beings, right? And many will argue it does take faith to believe that. But I see the grass outside, I see the sky, and these are testimonies to creation. And there's something much more beautiful than my own reason, than my own thought processes. Because when that's the only thing you think about, it can become lonely.
I like that. You can intellectualize everything and reduce everything, break everything down. But the world is beautiful, even though it's tragic. So are you saying maybe there's not a need to over-intellectualize everything? Some things can just be taken at face value and appreciated. You mentioned creation, nature. Is my understanding correct with what you're saying?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Why do you think there's that need to rationalize most things or to reason? Why do you think we have the need to reason something to the point where we miss it altogether? In your situation, maybe that could be argued with the philosophers sitting on a perch instead of getting out into the world and doing and being. And I don't know. Is that fair of me? I'm not
It
sure.
It is. That's a huge philosophy question. I'd give a narrow answer, which is like, let's imagine the trauma that people can experience and how out of control people can feel in their life. And sometimes I think turning to reason, and then the Enlightenment was bothered by, I think, some of the corruption they saw in the Catholic Church, and the corruption they saw in the tradition. It became archaic. It became this broken system in some ways. So they turned to the control they can have with their own thought processing, with their own reason, and trying to create their enlightenment, trying to create their own transcendence, their own paradise.
There was a quote that I wrote down from this chapter that the quote says, "The escape from tyranny is often followed not by paradise, but a sojourn in the desert, aimless, confused, and deprived." Would you characterize that transcendence, I guess we could call it, away from the church into a postmodern era or into whatever you want to call it? Do you think that we've wandered into a desert aimlessly, or do you think that I am oversimplifying this? There's more purpose. The Enlightenment produced so much good. I think we could all attest to that. But do you think there's a component or some components of the thinking of the time or belief that has manifested itself negatively?
That's so interesting that you would take that psychological truth that when you escape tyranny, you want to go to paradise, but you kind of have to go through the desert. And this is kind of referring to the biblical story of Exodus, Moses gets the Israelites out of the slavery of Pharaoh, of the Egyptians. But then they're in the desert and they're not really following God, and they're just in the desert for a long time, 40 years, and they finally get to, the promised land. And I've mapped that onto trauma stories. That helps. It makes sense. Like if, let's say there's a spouse getting out of an abusive relationship, they get out of it, but they're out of that tyranny and they want to get in a better relationship, but kind of first they have to navigate what life is like without this tyrannical power, and that can be confusing. You have to go through that desert before you can get to a place where you can have a healthier relationship. But you mapped it onto history, and I thought that was very interesting, and I think there's something true to that. I think the Enlighteners were trying to get out of the tyranny of a corrupted religion, of corrupted religious practices, and they were shooting.
And who can blame them for that?
I like
right?
that. Good point.
Yeah.
And they were shooting for transcendence, and they just kind of fell flat on their face, and we're left with kind of some meaninglessness in society and philosophy after the Enlightenment hits its peak.
Yeah, I also noticed in the chapter, Austin, he does map the escape from tyranny more on the personal relationship level. Basically, the whole chapter runs through an example of a marriage or a failed marriage. And I think that's more so where that quote comes from. But I do think it, to your point, maybe it could apply to history or to other things.
Any thoughts there, Patrick?
Well, let's see here. I was going to bring up as well how it relates to Exodus, and there's a really interesting part. The Israelites actually at one point in time were saying they wanted to go back to Egypt and be slaves again. We often see people in relationships like that, whether the good or bad, they often go back to what they once left just because it was known. Maybe they didn't have to set a new aim and something new to be precise in, because that's really hard to do.
Yes.
And so it's much easier to go back and be stuck where you were / are, less effort. So just something to keep in mind just for our personal selves when we do finally leave something we find tyrannical or wrong in our lives. The only way to not go back to it is to have our eyes forward, truly set on the aim. And then I really like this chapter in just being precise, just in general, making a real true claim on what it is you're seeking and then pursuing. And you seek, you shall find. And that's the only way to not go back. I think is one of the points he's trying to make. And one of the points we see in the Exodus story. To not go back, you have to have this defined. Very accurately, too. Very accurately.
Because tyranny is still a form of order.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Great point. Yes. Very good point.
And that the chaos of the desert can be terrifying. I actually have a contemporary Christian song in mind. It's really popular. Do you know the song Oceans by Hillsong?
Yes.
Can you picture that? Like, it's just, I think the song pictures this idea of standing out and before an ocean and this vastness and just walking out in trust. And I think the songwriter had the idea of, was it maybe Peter walking out in the water?
That was my understanding.
Yeah. Well, we see Peter kind of do this. You just step out into the possibility of drowning. And I think that's the problem. I think it's trust. Because the Israelites were trying to learn how to trust God in the unknown. And they would rather just kind of run back to the tyranny of the known. Well, I know we're going to get food in Egypt. So let's go back. Because I have to trust that food's going to materialize from the sky. Like, I don't know if I want to trust that or not. So I think trust is part of that.
Think of how strong the pull of knowing where your next meal is coming from, where food and water is going to come from, because they had just got done witnessing 10 crazy miracles before even getting out. Then the Egyptians were drowned in the in the Nile, and then they had a pillar by night, and then a pillar of clouds by day, and yet through all that they still wanted to go back. So I'm saying they had all of this stuff that they know they could have put their trust into. They could have easily, and yet still they had that strong feeling.
Yeah, well, they're still in the desert.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And that kind of, this is a side note. Maybe we should get into this at some other point, but that has a lot to do with fasting, which is interesting. We'll talk about that later.
Ooh, expound on that. Come on.
Well, I mean, just real quick. So making the choice to fast, to forego literal food fasts. Hunger is one of the most key driving forces humans face. And so being able to forsake that and still make good, rational, cognitive, wise decisions is that's a very powerful thing to do when you're really hungry. It would be a lot if we took a deep dive, so we could wait a little bit.
Well, I think that's why fasting is such a spiritual thing.
Yeah, it is, exactly.
You're saying there's something I spiritually depend on more than food, right? There's something, and we see that in many religions. There's something real to that.
Definitely. And that's freaking awesome.
Do you guys practice fasting at all?
Regrettably, no.
Not for a long time. I mean, I think we've all fasted before, but I don't on a regular basis.
Yeah, I don't either. I think I did a bit when I was younger, when maybe we were in high school. Just as a reminder for the listeners, Austin, Pat, and I went to high school together, a small Christian school in the Cincinnati area. But yeah, I think we did for like a Bible study or things of that nature. But I find that I'm, more irritable. I'm less clear in my thoughts when I am hungry. So there is something powerful about it, because you do have to rely more on God, because you're at your wit's end. Things that would come easier to you become harder as a result, I think, of being hungry or fasting. Definitely a powerful vehicle for humbling yourself and relying on the will of God. But I don't practice it. I mean, the truth of the matter is I really have no interest in practicing it, but my will is too weak.
I wanted to ask a question as it relates to ignored reality. This is a point that Peterson makes, and I think it's worth talking about. Yeah, here's a quote. Ignored reality manifests itself in an abyss of confusion and suffering. So, for an example, or to make it more concrete, if you're ignoring your responsibilities, you'll start to kind of get swallowed up by chaos and suffering. I feel like that relates to the aim part we were talking about earlier, but any thoughts on ignored reality?
Oh man, that's so true, the getting swallowed up by chaos if you're ignoring responsibility. I was telling you guys before the call, I slept in more today than I have in a long time, and I didn't realize how important it is for me to wake up at a reasonable hour and to, just start doing simple things, chores, whatever it might be. And today's been very good, but it also, something feels off, even though that's a small responsibility of waking up, starting my day. But when I wake up and I start scrambling, even that little bit of chaos, I can feel. Truthfully, maybe I would not have changed anything. Maybe my body did need to rest, but to maybe delve into more of a deeper example of that, maybe it could be something more consequential, like we don't have kids, but if you're not responsible for the people, if you do have kids that you're in charge of, it's multiple people that are hurting or going without their needs being met. So yeah, it's definitely important to stand up to the responsibilities that you do have in the day, because they're only going to keep growing as we continue to get older.
Do you guys agree with his estimation on that these are true sins when you omit your responsibilities?
Oh, was he? I thought he was talking more about speech for the sins of omission. Or are you applying it to the responsibilities? Everything all encompassing? Okay.
I don't like to, but I think I would say yeah, I think so.
Austin, it seems like you're lost in thought over there.
I was just listening, but yeah, I was thinking about, I think his example about relationships was pretty powerful to me, because he, like you said, throughout the chapter, he's talking about a married couple, but then he focuses in on, like in communication within a marriage. If you're not being clear in what you're talking about with your spouse, the conversation could start to begin to be about everything. So if you're not careful about what you're talking about, then you could just start bringing in all the things that are wrong in the relationship. And then that just piles up.
To the point earlier, that's drowning in chaos when you're just bringing it is helpful to have that what are we talking about specifically, and focus on that instead of bringing in examples. And that's easy to do when, if you're in an argument or a fight and they're maybe critiquing you on something you don't want to hear, and then they're saying, well, you do this, and then you could say, well, you do that, and then the conversation, where's it going now? It's no longer productive. It's no longer about the one thing that maybe they were trying to tell you in confidence, or they wanted to talk about this one thing, but now you're bringing in something else, and then maybe they bring in something else, and now what are we talking about anymore other than just fighting?
Have you experienced that in relationships, Patrick?
Run it by me one more time.
That if you're not being careful about what you're talking about, it can start to turn into a conversation about everything, because
oh yeah, definitely,
a negative emotion can start to, you just start bringing in things that you have had problems with.
Yeah, definitely.
He's got to be careful because his girlfriend's sitting behind him.
Sorry for the hot seat
just
question.
Just joking with you, Pat. Funny. No, I get it though. Yeah, I don't think we're saying anything on here that's betraying the trust of our loved ones, but I mean, just generally speaking, I think we can, even with our parents, we're older now, we don't live at home, so there's not much, I wouldn't say there's much for us to have disagreements or arguments about with them when it comes to specific actions that we're doing. But, there still could be conversations, maybe of a parent or a close friend that's trying to bring a conversation, or it could be a critique even, to our attention. And if we're not willing to hear that or deal with those issues, and let's assume, too, that they're doing it in a respectful way. They're not just being joiks. Which for the listener at home means jerk. So let's assume that their intentions are good and that they're bringing something to our care that needs to be considered. We shouldn't just shirk that away. We shouldn't bring in other issues into that issue to drown the conversation. But it is difficult to deal with those things. It's tough to hear criticisms. It's like, that's not fun. I think the default is to kind of ignore or not deal with those things, to sweep them under the rug. But
why?
Well, I think it's difficult to look at where you're not measuring up, because there's so many areas that could be, or at least it can feel that way. But realistically, there's probably a few areas where we're not meeting expectations, or we're not measuring up to the people that we love or to ourselves personally. But it can feel, if you're not confronting yourself about it, or you're not having that careful, precise speech with the people that it would apply to in the moment that it's happening, you could feel like, I have so many faults wrong with me. How can I deal with one of them? You can get overwhelmed, I think, is kind of the theme that's been running through this discussion.
What's a part of improving yourself is allowing the dead parts of yourself to come off, to die. And
separate the wheat from the chaff. Yeah.
Yes. And that's painful, and that goes against your pride because you're trying to defend yourself. You're trying to defend the decisions that you made. But, oh no, maybe you've made some mistakes and you need to admit to that, and you need to gotta step into that tension.
We can't forget that not doing these things is a very fast track to hell, like in a very literal sense, and then our day-to-day live sense. Like, you will quickly find yourself consumed, like you guys were saying, in chaos if you do omit these things, if you forsake these things. And I mean, he even says that at one point in there, like, he straight up, like, something like, do not underestimate the destructive power of sins of omission. And that is exactly what he means.
We are shaped and informed by what we voluntarily encounter, and we shape what we inhabit as well in that encounter. This is difficult, but the difficulty is not relevant because the alternative is worse. And I think that hits on what both of you guys were just saying. It's difficult to look at ourselves, to be critical, to have difficult conversations, especially with a spouse, a close friend, etc. Those relationships that we highly value. It can sometimes feel like that conversation will lead to other problems, or that the difficulty is just too great. Why take it on? But then, I mean, this quote is letting us know, like, the alternative is worse. And, if anything, you just continue to dwell in an unhappiness if you're not willing to have that rigorous examination of yourself, or that conversation with others if you are unhappy, and that conversation could help resolve that unhappiness. Maybe it's worth having. Or I should say, it is worth having.
And it's scary to think when you become familiar with that will be your choice to stay in. And it's the easier choice. That's another version of tyranny. And that's, like Austin was saying earlier, that's also actually a form of order, which is known and easy to stay in.
I'm an Enneagram 9, so there was a lot of references about peacekeeping in this chapter, which hit me hard specifically because it's not good of you to sweep things under the rug in order to keep a false sense of the peace. Sometimes it's better to have that conversation, get to the root of the matter, and just be done with it, to your point, Pat.
Here's a quote.
That's the harder thing.
There is little in a marriage that is so little that is not worth fighting about.
Holy cow. Yeah.
I didn't realize it was going to lead to that, but that's something Peterson says in the same chapter. And that threw me for a loop when I first read it, because it felt like, were we trying to like nitpick everything? But I think the point is, when there's conflict, try to use fair-minded communication as much as you can to try to get back on the same page. And oh my gosh, it's so easy to let things go, because I'm very similar to Logan in wanting to be a peacekeeper, peacemaker, and just like avoiding a conversation or just being patient to the point where I don't talk about my own emotions or my own feelings. And that could cause some problems in a relationship for sure.
So why do you think in this chapter Jordan uses this example, especially with all these relationship things, with being precise in your speech? Because it's real difficult if only one of the two is.
Yeah, if you're in any sort of relationship, friendship,
yeah, literally any
family,
exactly.
relationship,
yeah, that's what I meant. Yep.
And if it's generally problematic and both parties feel like this relationship is a problem, I think the only way for it to get better is to be specific, break it up into pieces and be specific about problems. That is not just like character shaming or judging, but it's when you say this, I feel this way. Or when you say this, it feels to me like you're saying it like this, and then the other person could clarify. If you can try to break it into pieces and be precise in your speech, that can give positive headway. But oh my gosh, easier said than done.
It is easier said than done, but it's also as simple as that, though, which is the crazy thing.
Wow, it's both true.
Yeah. It really shouldn't be as difficult as it sounds, but our pride is so strong.
Our pride is so strong. Yes.
And it reminds me, in the book of James, it says, "To he who knows what he ought to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." It's James 4:17. I guess depending on the translation you read. But that idea is very similar here, if not the same.
Right. The sin of omission. Yeah, it's almost like a trust your own judgment kind of thing too. Like, if you see something that's off and you don't do anything about it, James is like, it's safe to say that's a sin. Don't do that.
We even have a saying at the company that I'll be leaving shortly, but the saying is, see something, say something. And that saying almost seems like it derives from this kind of truth where if something feels off or seems off, it's better to say something now because it could grow later. Maybe it's a problem that could nag or persist, but if something just kind of feels off in the moment, sure, it might be a little awkward having that confrontation, but at least you're saying it now, because saying it in a year after that problem has persisted for that long, it's going to be a lot more difficult to deal with. I love the anecdote he shares, or it's not an anecdote, sorry, it's a reference to the story about the dragon. I thought that was great because for the listener, if you've been reading along with us, or even just for some background, he shares a story about a dragon, and the dragon is about the size of a cat, and it lives in the house with a boy and his mother. I forget what the name of that story is called, but as the story progresses, the dragon starts growing whenever the mother does not acknowledge that the dragon's in the house. And eventually the dragon gets so big that it takes up the entire house, and the mom and the boy, I think, get pushed out of the house, or they're like, basically have no room to live in the house. And then when eventually the mother acknowledges the dragon, it starts to shrink, and it shrinks and shrinks until it's about the size of the house cat again, after they keep acknowledging it and talking about the dragon, which they had been ignoring throughout most of the story. And then at the end, I forget what the mother asks a great question, something along the lines of why did that dragon get as big as it did? And then the son says, I think it just wanted to be noticed. And obviously our problems don't have feelings like that dragon would, but I think there is some kind of truth there to the problems that we do have. Maybe they just need to be noticed and talked about. Curious to get your guys' thoughts.
I think this issue is particularly difficult in communities like schools. So, my mom is a principal at a Christian school. Has it been 7 years or longer that she's been a principal?
Hold up, what?
Yeah, time flies.
Dang, bro.
For the
Cow.
listener, Austin's mom, when we were in school at the Christian high school, she was our science teacher. She taught a couple different courses in the sciences, but now she's a principal. She was promoted since we've graduated.
That just
so my mama, principal mom. So, she's noticed kind of a trend, and I've noticed in just the stories she's talked about over the years, that when something bad happens in the school, kids won't say something about it because it's considered snitching. And this idea of snitching, it does come from, the culture of hip-hop, and it does come from this idea of gang culture from inner cities as well. Like, that's a thing where in order for gangs to stay together, and functioning, you can't have anybody ratting anybody else out to the police, right? So I think that has kind of permeated all throughout the U.S., even in a, predominantly white Christian school. There's diversity, but just this idea that snitching is such a bad thing to do. But when you avoid snitching, you're allowing all these dragons to grow up in this community, and you're allowing all these problems to go unnoticed and the suffering go unchecked. And oh man, what kind of advice do you give a high schooler who's concerned about not being considered a snitch, but is still seeing these problems and doesn't want to stand up for, I don't know, bullying or other things like that? How do you combat that?
I think that's interesting to bring that example of the story outside of the context of the home or your close interpersonal relationships in a house, and then applying it to a school where there's obviously a lot of other complicated, complex relationships going on. What's the motivation of the student to not, quote unquote, snitch or rat someone out? It could be detrimental to status. They could actually know the person and not want any undue consequence to befall them. There's probably any number of reasons. That's just a couple. But I think we would assume, right, that they know this. All the students, should something happen, would know that the thing is wrong.
In general, yes, for sure.
We would assume. Yeah. But then why not tell the truth?
I think it's maybe that idea of sacrificing your pride or having to dive into the tension that could cause, like, oh my gosh, this person who's did this wrong thing is going to think of me.
Yeah, the conflict.
Yeah, the conflict.
That's so much of school is avoiding conflict.
Yeah, good point.
This chapter seems to be kind of really emphasizing the need for conflict and how that's the best way to keep sustained peace, is to just talk about the issue. So, Austin, you have the perspective of being a substitute teacher now. Would you say that there's value, maybe if they're not going to a principal or teacher necessarily to talk about something that's happened, do you find that there's value, just conversations amongst students that may be difficult? Say something were to happen, them settling it amongst each other, or do you think there needs to be a discussion with an authority figure like the teacher?
That's a great question. I don't think I have a face value answer, but I think students that care about justice are constantly evaluating the impact of possible suffering. So, like, if something like, I don't know, stupid happens in class, it would be probably foolish for a student to like rat someone out all the time for something, and that's just, you need to be discerning in those situations. But if the student sees someone really being hurt, okay, I think this is a time for me to... So it's just like constantly trying to discern when you need to address an issue and who you need to address the issue to. The person causing the problem, or the person in authority that could do something about it, or the person that's been hurt. Like, there's a lot of decisions to be made. So I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to highlight the complexity of it and the need for discernment in order to try to seek justice in the most effective way.
Well, it's even harder to even attempt or want to address anything like that if you don't have a solid support system, whether it be supportive family or friends.
Exactly.
Are you talking about the school example specifically, Pat?
Could even relate to work, like our individual jobs or something. Because if you really are going to, for lack of a better term, stick your neck out there for someone else or even for yourself, and it doesn't go well, I mean, that's even harder if you don't have friends to back you up or to catch you or something like that.
Or even to help you think.
Right.
And that's probably another reason why a lot of people don't say anything as well, or take some form of action.
Oh, because they maybe don't feel like they have the proper support backing them?
Maybe, yeah. Because I can think of some examples that we've personally had where sometimes it's been easy. Well, I'd say most of the times it's been easy to step up or support someone, because I knew, like, whether it be my family or one of you two or anything like that. Like I could explain the situation and just be supported.
Listening is such an undervalued skill. I think a couple episodes ago we talked about that. Just like people that truly listen to you and want to ask you questions and better understand what you mean, where you're coming from. To Pat's point, I think that can't be valued enough.
Yeah, we probably overestimate people's friendships. People probably don't have as deep of friendships as we think they do.
Why do you think that is?
Hard to say, especially since we only know the lives we've lived. But from hearing from other people, especially older generations, just social media connections just aren't generally the same. They're not saying they're not bad. They actually are quite valuable. But they may not always allow as deep as a face-to-face interaction could be, or as nice as like a hug could be in a situation when you need one, or stuff like that maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, that digital interactions should never be traded for like you were saying, a hug. You'll never be able to get that kind of feeling via the digital sphere. And watch me say that, and then next week Facebook releases something, but
yeah, there's definitely, I think, less accountability just in the relationship itself if it's not in person too. But here we are on a Zoom call.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah. Well, but to be fair, we didn't meet on a Zoom call. The Zoom call facilitates our friendship, and I think all of us would agree, being in person beats any type of video
100%.
Communication by a mile.
100%.
So if we all lived closer together, we'd be in that room, mucking it up, boys being boys,
putting holes in walls. Oh my goodness.
I think that was a great conversation summarizing chapter 10.
Life is effortful maintenance. Pour into the relationships that you love and have those difficult conversations. What do you guys think?
One quote that I really like that he says all the time, that I associate with this chapter, that I try to tell myself all the time, whether it be like at my apartment, which I fail at a lot. I'm a lot better at this at work, but it's slay the dragon in its lair. And that idea of take care of it now before it's too late. Like that, I associate that strongly with being precise in your speech.
Get it while it's sleeping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Before it becomes something, take it down.
Let's go, baby.
And oh my goodness, you can't find all the dragons in your life by yourself. You have to have other eyes,
amen.
Other people in your life, pointing out to you those caves with those sleeping dragons.
Someone's got to watch your back.
Well, and even Austin, that's such a good point, because even in the example of the story in the chapter, the boy points it out to the mother. Even in that case, you're going to have a short-sightedness, or you're not going to see it at first. I mean, you might as it gets bigger, or you might have seen it all along, who knows, but to just have someone call it out and bring it to your attention, I think, is valuable.
As long as we remember for further conversations, just for the rest of our lives, really, how important this chapter really is and how it relates to our claims of Christianity, our speech really does need to be insanely precise, as do our actions behind our speech. Otherwise, it really will be meaningless. So it's just an important thing to remember.
This is difficult for a verbal processor to hear, but I'm kidding. No, you're right, Pat. It is important.
This is good, though. That's a manual for authentic living.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another conversation.